I'll paraphrase the script while keeping the same dramatic storytelling style and structure. In the sweltering summer of 1856, deep in the heart of rural Texas, wealthy slave owners held an event they casually referred to as the race. It was no competition. It was a scheduled slaughter, bloody entertainment for rich men grown bored with lives of luxury erected on the misery of others. Once each year, during 3 nights of the new moon, planters from across the South converged on Blackwater Plantation, their pockets heavy with gold and their souls hollow of any humanity. The rules were as simple as they were savage. 10 enslaved men were set loose into the swamp at 9 o'clock at night. At 9:15, the hunters followed. White men on horseback, armed with rifles, accompanied by packs of dogs bred and trained to rip human flesh from bone. Wagering began weeks in advance. How long would the swiftest man last? How many bodies would be dragged out by morning? Which master owned the most resilient slave? In 7 years of this ritual, not a single man had ever survived the Blackwater race. 70 black men had been cast into that swampy nightmare. 70 men had perished, shot down, drowned, torn to pieces by dogs, or simply consumed by the mud and the darkness. Their bodies fed the alligators. Their names were erased before dawn broke. And the following morning, while house slaves scrubbed blood from the master's boots, life across the plantations carried on as though nothing had occurred. But in the 8th year, something shifted. Among the 10 men chained in Blackwater Plantation's yard that June evening, there was one the other slaves knew only as Abel. His back bore the scars of 200 lashes. His eyes had watched his wife and children sold off to distant plantations. His hands had known nothing but labor and suffering. But his mind had been occupied for months, quietly constructing something no slave owner could have ever imagined. While white men sipped imported whiskey and counted towers of gold coins by lantern light, while they cleaned their weapons and fed their dogs raw meat to stoke their hunger, Abel studied the 9 men standing beside him. And every one of them looked back, because they all understood that this night would be unlike any before it. This night, the hunters would become the hunted. Before we continue with this shocking story, tell me which city are you watching from? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Let's continue. Blackwater Plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of East Texas wilderness, where pine forests bled into cypress swamps and the land itself appeared to swallow secrets in its dark waters. Colonel James Whitmore had inherited the estate from his father, along with 147 human beings he treated as livestock. But the colonel had grown restless with cotton and tobacco. He craved something more stimulating than harvest tallies and profit ledgers. And so he invented the race. The first year, in 1849, it had been nearly accidental, a drunken wager between Whitmore and 3 neighboring planters over whose slaves could run fastest through the swamp. By the second year, word had traveled across the South. Wealthy men arrived from as far as Charleston and New Orleans, bringing their finest horses, most lethal weapons, and most expendable property. The event grew into legend within the shadowy world of plantation elites, whispered about in gentlemen's clubs and discussed over brandy and cigars, but never breathed aloud in polite company or within earshot of northern abolitionists. The swamp itself was ideally suited for the purpose. 2 miles deep and 3 miles wide, it was a labyrinth of black water, cypress knees, quicksand pits, and predators, both reptilian and insect. A man could vanish there and never be recovered. Many had. But while Colonel Whitmore believed he controlled every element of his twisted spectacle, he had made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed the men he drove into that swamp were broken, defeated, too terrified and worn down to think beyond their own survival. He never considered that they could plan. He never imagined they might communicate. He never dreamed they were capable of organizing. And he certainly never suspected that his own house slaves, the ones he trusted to serve his meals and polish his boots, were woven into the conspiracy. 3 months before the 8th annual race, Abel had been sold to Blackwater Plantation for $800. He arrived in chains, his body hollowed out from weeks on the auction circuit, his spirit supposedly shattered by the loss of his family. Colonel Whitmore considered it a bargain, a prime field hand at nearly half the going rate of $1,500 for a healthy male slave in his late 20s. Abel's reputation as a troublemaker had driven his price down considerably. He had attempted escape twice at his previous plantation in Louisiana, been caught both times, and punished with 100 lashes each time. The scars crossing his back like a brutal map of defiance and resistance. What the colonel never knew was that Abel had learned something during those failed attempts. He had learned patience. He had learned to watch, to listen, to absorb information while appearing crushed and defeated. And most importantly, he had learned that freedom achieved alone was no freedom at all. Not when it meant leaving brothers and sisters behind in bondage. Not when your own liberation was built upon the continued suffering of those who had sheltered you, helped you, and kept your secrets. On his 3rd day at Blackwater, while breaking his back in the cotton fields beneath a June sun that turned the air thick as syrup, Abel overheard 2 overseers discussing the race. They spoke casually, laughing about the previous year's event, about how the betting pool had swelled to $20,000 in gold and banknotes. About how one man had made it nearly a mile before the dogs caught him and tore his legs open. About how another had attempted to conceal himself underwater inside a cypress hollow and drowned when he stayed submerged too long. The overseers found it all tremendously funny, slapping their thighs and wiping laughter from their eyes. They mentioned that Colonel Whitmore himself had pocketed $4,000 on a wager that no slave would survive past midnight, confirming once again that the colonel understood his property better than anyone. Abel said nothing. He kept his head low, his hands moving steadily through the cotton bolls, filling his sack with the white fiber that built Southern fortunes. But his mind was racing, calculating, storing every word. That evening in the slave quarters, a cluster of crude wooden cabins behind the main house where the enslaved lived in conditions barely suitable for animals, Abel sat quietly while the others ate their meager rations of cornmeal and salt pork. The portions were measured carefully to provide just enough nourishment to sustain their labor, but never enough to satisfy the gnawing, permanent hunger. He listened to the conversations around him, learning names, relationships, hierarchies, and the invisible social order that pulsed beneath the surface of plantation life. There was Samuel, an enormous man who worked as the plantation's blacksmith, worth at least $2,000 for his specialized skills in metalwork and repair. There was Moses, quick-minded and clever, who tended the colonel's horses, among them a thoroughbred stallion valued at $3,000 shipped from Kentucky. There was Isaiah, who had been at Blackwater longer than anyone, 15 years of unbroken servitude that had left him gaunt but sharply observant, his value diminished to perhaps $500 due to age and visible exhaustion. There was Caleb, young and powerfully built at 22, purchased just months earlier from an Alabama plantation for $1,200, his youth and strength making him valuable for the hardest field work. And there was Ruth, one of the house slaves, who cleaned the colonel's study and listened to conversations the white men assumed were private. Her value set at $1,000 despite the fact that she could read and write, skills she concealed carefully, because literacy in a slave was considered dangerous. Abel observed them all. He said little during those first weeks, presenting himself as quiet and obedient, never drawing attention, never meeting white men's eyes directly, completing every task with mechanical precision. The overseers began to relax around him, satisfied that the whippings at his former plantation had finally extinguished whatever defiant spirit he once carried. They stopped monitoring him as closely. And that was precisely what Abel wanted. Invisibility was its own kind of freedom, the freedom to watch without being watched, to plan without being suspected. It was Ruth who came to him first. She appeared at his cabin on a moonless night 2 weeks after his arrival, moving through the darkness like smoke. Abel had been lying on his rough straw mattress, staring up at the ceiling through gaps in the wooden planks, when her shadow materialized in his doorway. The cabin was barely 10 feet square, with walls that didn't meet the roof and a dirt floor that turned to mud when it rained. 6 men slept there, crammed together. But that night Abel was alone, the others occupied on a night shift in the sugar house. "You planning something?" she whispered. It was not a question. It was a declaration of fact. Abel remained still, uncertain whether this was a trap. House slaves occasionally reported to the master in exchange for small privileges, an extra portion of meat, a warmer blanket, a day free of labor. The masters called them good slaves and rewarded their betrayals. The other enslaved people called them something else entirely. Ruth seemed to read his thoughts. "I ain't no informer. I've been here 6 years. I seen 3 races. I seen 30 men go into that swamp. 30 men who never came back. One of them was my brother. His name was Daniel. He was 16 years old. The dogs got him in the first hour. I heard him screaming from the main house while I was serving brandy to the men, betting on how long he'd last." Abel sat up slowly in the faint starlight filtering through the cabin walls. He could see her face clearly, the hatred burning in her eyes like embers, the same hatred he carried in his own chest like a stone he could never set down. "I heard the overseers talking about you," Ruth continued, her voice barely a breath. "Said you tried to run twice before at the merchant plantation in Louisiana. Said you took 100 lashes each time and didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't break. Said you're either the bravest fool they ever laid eyes on or the most dangerous man on this property. I think you're dangerous. And I think you're planning something for the race." Abel studied her for a long moment, measuring the risk. Then he nodded once, slowly, committing himself to trust. Because without trust, there could be no plan, no resistance, no chance at all. "The colonel keeps his guns in a cabinet in his study," Ruth said quickly, as though she had been holding this information for months, waiting for the right moment. 6 rifles, 4 pistols, all loaded and ready. The key hangs on a hook behind his desk, right beside the portrait of his father. Every night after supper he drinks a bottle of bourbon, sometimes 2 if the day has gone well. By 10 o'clock he can barely stand upright. The overseers play cards in the barn until midnight, drinking corn whiskey and gambling pocket money. There are 12 dogs in the kennel, but only one handler sleeps nearby, in a small room attached to the kennel wall, and he's deaf in his left ear from a hunting accident 5 years back. Abel felt something stir in his chest, something that had been absent for years. Hope. Treacherous, perilous hope that could get you killed if you leaned on it too heavily. But also the only thing that made survival worth pursuing. "How many others know?" he asked quietly. "Samuel knows. Moses knows. Isaiah has been talking about something like this for years, but he never had anyone willing to lead. Nobody reckless enough to try. There are others, too. People in the house, people who move freely around the property. Maybe 10, 12 people in total who would help if they believed there was a genuine chance. We've been waiting. Waiting for someone like you." Isaiah, despite his age and the trembling in his worn hands, proved to possess the sharpest memory among them. He recounted every detail of the previous 7 races, describing the exact timing, the positions of the hunters, the routes the fleeing men had taken. He remembered that the hunters always separated into 3 groups. One sweeping left around the swamp's perimeter, one sweeping right, one driving straight through the center in a wedge formation. He remembered that the dogs were always released first, always from the eastern side where the ground was firmest and allowed them to build momentum. He remembered that the colonel himself never entered the swamp, instead presiding from a raised wooden platform near the starting point, about 8 feet high, offering him a clear view of the initial chase. From that platform he collected late wagers and distributed winnings to those who had correctly predicted survival times and manner of death. The previous year's race had drawn 17 plantation owners and a betting pool of $23,000, the largest assembled yet. Ruth continued serving in the main house, listening to every conversation, reading every letter left carelessly on the colonel's desk, studying the rhythms and routines of the White household. She learned that this year's race was set for June 15th, 16th, and 17th during the new moon, when darkness would be absolute and the hunting most demanding. She learned that invitations had gone out to planters across 5 states, each hand-delivered by trusted servants. She learned that the colonel had boasted to his associates about acquiring fresh stock, including a troublemaker from Louisiana sure to provide exciting sport. A clear reference to Abel himself. She learned that the entry fee for hunters had been raised to $500 per night, all proceeds folded into the prize pool, making this year's event potentially the most lucrative yet. The colonel anticipated drawing perhaps 30 participants and a betting pool exceeding $40,000. But most critically, Ruth learned something the colonel had mentioned casually over dinner, something he considered trivial, but which completely altered Abel's planning. This year, for the first time, the selected slaves would be left unchained during the afternoon before the race. The colonel wanted to allow them time to build up hope before crushing it in the swamp. He believed this psychological cruelty would sharpen the entertainment, that men who spent hours contemplating possible escape routes would run harder, fight more desperately, offer better sport for the paying audience. The idea had come from a Mississippi plantation owner at the previous year's event, a man who claimed extensive expertise in managing slave psychology for optimal performance. When Ruth delivered this to Abel, he smiled for the first time since arriving at Blackwater. It was not the smile of happiness. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed the instrument of his enemy's destruction. "That's when we move," he said quietly. The plan took form slowly across the following weeks, refined through dozens of whispered exchanges, tested against every contingency they could envision. They would not attempt escape during the race itself, which was exactly what everyone expected, what every slave before them had attempted. They would not flee blindly into the swamp where terrain and trained hunters gave every advantage to the white men. Instead, they would invert the event entirely. Turn the hunters into the hunted. Use the chaos and darkness to their advantage and strike back with a violence that would echo across the South for generations. But they needed more than weapons and timing. They needed people willing to die if required. People willing to fight against impossible odds. People willing to sacrifice individual survival for collective retribution. They needed men who had arrived at the point where death held no more terror because life had become indistinguishable from it, where the only remaining choice was between dying like an animal or dying like a warrior. Abel approached each candidate personally, always late at night, always in private. Caleb was first. The young man from Alabama had been selected for the race, chosen for his youth and physical strength, qualities the colonel believed would generate exciting sport, a man who would run fast and hard before being brought down. When Abel laid out the entire plan without holding a single detail back, Caleb's eyes went wide with fear and something else, something that resembled hunger. "You talking about killing white men?" Caleb whispered, the words barely forming on his lips. "They'll hunt us down forever. They'll kill everyone on this plantation. They'll make an example that gets remembered for 100 years. They're going to kill us anyway," Abel replied with quiet calm, stating it as simple fact. "You've been selected for the race. You know what that means. You have maybe one chance in 100 of seeing sunrise, and that's if luck holds. Most men don't last 2 hours. The record is 3 hours and 40 minutes. Set 3 years ago by a man named Joshua, who nearly reached the western edge before the dogs cornered him against a ravine. They say he fought them with his bare hands for 15 minutes before a hunter put a bullet through his skull. 3 hours and 40 minutes of terror before dying. Is that the death you want? Caleb was silent for a long moment, his hands trembling faintly. Then he nodded. I'd rather die fighting than die running. I'd rather take some of them with me than just be their sport. Abel found similar resolve in the others. There was Thomas, a field hand who had watched his wife sold away 3 years earlier, her price of $900 used to cover the colonel's gambling debts after a ruinous night of cards in New Orleans. Thomas had tried to purchase her freedom. He had begged the colonel to sell him instead. He had offered to labor double shifts for the remainder of his life. The colonel had laughed in his face and sold the woman to a brothel in Mobile. There was Benjamin, whose arms bore scars from a punishment involving hot coals pressed against his skin for talking back to an overseer, a torture that had left his hands permanently damaged and reduced his value, but not his hatred. There was Elijah, whose 12-year-old son had been beaten to death for stealing an apple from the colonel's orchard. The child's body valued at nothing in the plantation ledgers, his murder recorded only as disposed of damaged property, with no explanation or consequence. There was Marcus, separated from his mother at age 8, sold at a Charleston auction for $400, who could still hear her screaming his name as the wagon pulled him away. There was Joseph, purchased just a year earlier for $1,000 after his former owner went bankrupt, who had come from a comparatively tolerable plantation and been dropped into Blackwater's brutality with no warning. Each man carried a story written in scars and loss. Each man had reached the place where death held no more terror than daily existence. Each man was ready. By late May, 10 men were committed to the plan. Weapons were hidden across 3 separate locations. They possessed detailed knowledge of the swamp, the timing of patrols, the habits of every overseer. Ruth and 3 other house slaves stood ready to help from inside the main house, to drug food if necessary, to unlock doors, to create distractions at precise moments. Moses was prepared to scatter the horses. Samuel stood ready to break the locks on the ammunition storage if an opportunity presented itself. What they lacked was any certainty the plan would succeed. Too many variables. Too many things could collapse. A single betrayal would doom every one of them to torture and public execution. A single hesitation or moment of panic could unravel months of careful work. The margin separating success from catastrophic failure was razor-thin. Abel lay awake at night dissecting every detail, probing for weaknesses, running scenarios through his mind. The weight of it pressed on him physically, like carrying another body on his back. These men were trusting him with their lives. If the plan collapsed, the repercussions would be measured in blood. The colonel would manufacture examples designed to crush any thought of resistance throughout the South for decades. Public executions calculated to reach every plantation, every slave quarter. But if they succeeded, if they actually pulled it off, they would deliver a blow that would ripple far beyond Blackwater Plantation. They would demonstrate that enslaved people could organize, could fight back, could defeat their oppressors against overwhelming odds. They would create a story that would travel from plantation to plantation, whispered in fields and cabins, embedded in coded spirituals, carrying the message of resistance and hope to thousands of people living without either. On June 1st, Colonel Whitmore made his official selections for the race. He assembled all the male slaves in the main yard and walked among them like a man inspecting livestock at market, examining muscles and teeth, asking questions about endurance and speed. He chose 10 men, reading their names aloud one by one with casual authority. Abel, Caleb, Thomas, Benjamin, Elijah, Marcus, Joseph, and 3 men who were no part of the conspiracy. Who knew nothing of the plan? Simon, David, and Jacob. Abel's heart dropped. 3 men who knew nothing. 3 men who could shatter everything through panic, ignorance, or plain misfortune. That evening he approached them separately, taking an enormous risk. Simon was 35, a quiet and self-contained man who had been at Blackwater 8 years. David was 42, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a lumber mill accident, an injury that had lowered his value by $300. Jacob was barely 19, newly purchased from a Mississippi plantation for $1,100, still raw from being torn from his mother just weeks before. Abel told each of them everything. The full plan. The weapons, the timing, the coordinated attack, the risks. He explained that 2 choices existed. Join the conspiracy and have a chance at freedom and vengeance. Or run blindly into the swamp and die like the 70 men who had gone before them, their deaths nothing more than entertainment for wealthy men who would forget their names before breakfast. Simon listened in complete silence, his face revealing nothing. Then he posed a single question in a voice as steady as iron. "You really think we can kill them all?" "No," Abel answered honestly, "because lies would serve no one now. I think some of us will die. Maybe most of us. Maybe all of us. But I'd rather die trying to take them with me than die running like an animal while they bet on how long I last." Simon considered this for a moment. Then he extended his hand. "I'm in. Been waiting 8 years for something like this." David was harder to persuade. He was older, more cautious, ground down by years of brutality that had taught him the futility of resistance. "Even if we kill everyone here," he said slowly, "they'll send the army. They'll send bounty hunters. They'll track us to Mexico if they have to. They'll make it a national cause. Proof that slaves can't be trusted. Justification for worse conditions everywhere." "Maybe," Abel agreed. "Probably. But at least we'll die as men, not as property. At least we'll make them pay a price. At least somewhere, some other slaves will hear about what we did and know it's possible." David stared at his mutilated hand, the absent fingers a permanent record of how cheaply white men valued black bodies. Finally he nodded. "All right. I'm in. Nothing left to lose anyway." Jacob was the greatest risk. He was young, frightened, still holding on to the illusion that compliance might earn mercy, that being a cooperative slave might result in decent treatment. But he was also raw with anger, still bleeding from being torn away from his mother and sold like livestock. Abel gambled on that anger. "They paid $1,100 for you," Abel told him quietly. "You know what that means. You're expensive property, prime stock. But the moment you step into that swamp you stop being valuable. You become entertainment. They're going to shoot you for sport, like a deer or a rabbit. Your mother let you be sold thinking at least you'd live, at least you'd survive even if she never laid eyes on you again. You want to prove her wrong. You want to die for their amusement 3 weeks after she said goodbye." Tears moved down Jacob's face, but his jaw was rigid. "What do I have to do?" They were 13 now. 10 who had planned for months and 3 who had been forced to adapt in an instant. It wasn't ideal. It would have to be enough. The final 2 weeks passed in agonizing slowness, each day stretching endlessly. The plantation hummed with preparations for the race. Carriages arrived daily, carrying wealthy men from across the South. They came with personal servants, hunting dogs straining on leashes, expensive rifles packed in polished leather cases. They filled the guest quarters in the main house and spilled into tents erected across the lawn, creating a temporary settlement of wealth and privilege. The smell of roasting meat and tobacco smoke hung over the property without pause. At night, lantern light poured from the main house windows as guests drank and gambled and swapped stories about previous hunts, about slaves they had killed, about the entertainment value of human suffering. Ruth reported names she overheard while serving drinks. Richard Beaumont from New Orleans, a sugar plantation owner worth over $200,000, who controlled 3 plantations and more than 400 slaves. Henry Caldwell from Alabama, who owned 4 plantations and nearly 600 slaves, who had built his empire on cotton and cruelty in equal portions. William Preston from Georgia, who had won $3,000 at the previous year's race by correctly predicting that one slave would survive past midnight but not see dawn. Thomas Ashford from Mississippi, who had arrived with 12 dogs and was offering side bets of $100 per dog on which animal would draw first blood. Jonathan Reed from South Carolina, who owned a slave trading company and had personally auctioned more than 15,000 human beings across his career, separating families and selling children with the mechanical efficiency of a man handling livestock. These were not desperate men. These were not men driven by need or poverty. They were the wealthiest and most powerful members of Southern society. Men who shaped laws and commanded governments. Men who occupied state legislatures and congressional seats. Men who regarded themselves as the summit of civilization while organizing hunts of human beings for Saturday evening amusement, finding no contradiction in attending Sunday services the following morning. The betting pool expanded larger than any previous year. By June 14th it had reached $52,000 in gold coins, banknotes, and promissory notes drawn from banks across the South. The colonel displayed it in leather bags on a dedicated table in the main house, arranged like hunting trophies. $52,000. More than any slave would see across 10 lifetimes of labor. More than most white men would earn across 20 years of work. Every dollar wagered on human suffering. The house slaves reported that the guests were unusually animated this year. They discussed hunting strategy, debated positions, compared weapons. They fed the dogs raw meat and denied them food for 2 days beforehand to drive their hunger and aggression to a lethal edge. On the morning of June 15th, the selected 13 were separated from the rest of the enslaved population and moved to a holding pen near the swamp's edge. As promised, they were left unchained, though 4 armed overseers monitored them constantly from a raised platform. They were given extra food, cornbread, and actual meat, a mockery of generosity designed to give them energy for running. The white men wanted good sport. They didn't want their quarry collapsing from exhaustion before the entertainment could begin. Abel used the time to walk the others through the plan one final time, speaking in voices too low for the overseers to catch. They gathered in a corner of the pen, their bodies forming a screen, their words carried off by the afternoon wind. Samuel would position himself near the eastern edge, where he had buried 3 iron blades wrapped in oilcloth. Moses would move toward the western side, close to where the horses were tied to a rail fence. Thomas and Benjamin would stay together in the center, where crude wooden spears had been buried beneath leaves and mud. The rest would spread into a loose formation, each man knowing his role, each prepared to adjust when things went wrong, as they inevitably would. The critical moment would come 30 minutes after their release, when the hunters were inside the swamp with confidence high and vigilance low. The slaves would not be running. They would be circling back, following paths they had memorized across months, positioning themselves for ambush, converting prey into predators. "They think we're animals," Abel told the group in a low voice. "They think we'll run in panic and die easy. That's what 7 years have shown them. That's what they expect. So we give them the opposite. We move slow and deliberate. We move quiet. We use everything we know about this swamp, and they know nothing. And when they come into our territory, when they're scattered and certain, we take them apart one by one." As night fell across Blackwater Plantation, the guests gathered near the starting point. Dozens of lanterns lit the scene, casting long, swaying shadows across the lawn. Dogs strained and snarled at their leashes. Hunters checked weapons with practiced calm, loading rifles and pistols, adjusting sights, preparing for an evening's entertainment. The colonel stood on his raised platform addressing the crowd with whiskey-soaked authority, his voice carrying across the assembled wealth. "Gentlemen," he called out, spreading his arms wide. "Welcome to the 8th annual Blackwater race. This year we present 13 fine specimens for your entertainment. The betting pool stands at $52,000, the largest in our history. As always, wagers may be placed on survival time, distance traveled, or manner of death. The prey will be released at 9 o'clock sharp. The hunt begins at 9:15. May the best hunter win, and may we all enjoy a profitable evening." The crowd erupted with enthusiasm. Last-minute wagers changed hands. Someone bet $500 that no slave would cross the first creek. Another bet $300 that the dogs would kill at least 3 men before a hunter fired a single shot. The atmosphere was festive, almost celebratory, indistinguishable from a county fair or holiday gathering. The 13 men were escorted to the starting line by overseers carrying whips and rifles. Abel looked back across the assembled white men, at their confident faces, their expensive clothing, their weapons gleaming in the lantern light. He memorized every detail. These were people who considered themselves superior, who believed a divine right justified owning and destroying human beings, who had constructed an entire civilization on the principle that some lives held value and others did not. In a few hours, Abel thought, some of those faces would be gone forever. The colonel raised a pistol above his head. The crowd fell silent. Then he fired into the sky, the shot cracking across the property. The race had begun. The 13 men sprinted into the darkness, their feet churning through the shallow water at the swamp's edge. Behind them the crowd roared with excitement. Someone called encouragement to their preferred hunter. The dogs howled desperately against their leashes. But for exactly 15 minutes, the slaves had a head start. Time to put distance between themselves and the hunting party. Time to disappear into the labyrinth of black water and tangled trees. Abel led the group deeper into the swamp, but not at full speed. Running flat out would drain them within minutes and leave them gasping for air when silence was what they needed. They had to preserve energy and remain together. In previous years, enslaved men had scattered in panic, each one trying to save himself alone. That instinct had doomed every one of them to isolation and death. 200 yards, then we split, Abel called back, his voice low but clear. Remember the markers. Remember the plan. They had spent weeks internalizing this terrain, mapping every feature into memory. A lightning-struck cypress meant turn left toward solid ground. A cluster of rocks meant safe footing for 50 feet. A patch of glowing moss meant quicksand capable of consuming a man in minutes. Knowledge was their only real advantage against horses, guns, and trained dogs. At exactly 9:15 they heard the second shot. The hunters were moving. They heard dogs baying in the distance, men calling to each other, the heavy splash of horses entering the water. Now, Abel hissed. The group divided into 4 units as planned. Abel took Simon, Jacob, and Caleb, circling east toward where Samuel had hidden the weapons. Thomas and Benjamin moved west with David toward the buried wooden spears. Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah headed north into the deepest section of the swamp, where horses could not follow, where the water rose above a man's head and cypress roots created a maze impossible to navigate without intimate familiarity. Each group knew their route, their destination, their timing. The plan was for all of them to circle back toward the starting point from different directions, generating confusion, making the hunters believe they were chasing fleeing prey when in reality they were walking into carefully prepared killing grounds. Abel's group moved quickly through water that rose to their thighs, cold and black and smelling of rot. Behind them they could hear the hunters shouting positions to one another, the dogs baying with bloodlust. But the sounds were moving in the wrong direction. The hunters were following the obvious trail, the one that drove deeper into the swamp in a straight line. "They think we're running straight like everyone before, following instinct instead of strategy," Caleb whispered. "Good," Abel replied. "Let them think we're animals." They reached the lightning-struck cypress and found Samuel's cache exactly where it had been placed. 3 iron blades filed sharp and wrapped in oilcloth. Abel took one, feeling the weight settle in his palm, the rough grip Samuel had fashioned. He passed the others to Caleb and Jacob. Simon lifted a branch as thick as a man's forearm, which would serve as an effective club. "Remember what we planned," Abel said quietly, all of them crouching in the shadows with water lapping at their chests. "We don't attack unless we're certain we can win. We target stragglers and isolated hunters. We avoid groups. We use the dark and their own confusion against them." They crouched low in the water with only their heads above the surface and waited, with the patience of men who had spent their entire lives waiting, who understood that patience was sometimes the only power the powerless possessed. The first hunter appeared 23 minutes later, pushing through the darkness alone. He was young, perhaps 25, wearing expensive riding clothes now soaked and caked with mud. He carried a rifle that had probably cost more than Abel's sale price, a beautiful weapon with silver inlay and a polished stock. He moved carelessly, thrashing through the water, making no attempt at silence. He was certain the prey were ahead of him, fleeing in panic, and not behind him, crouched in the darkness and waiting. He never saw Abel rise from the water like something conjured from the swamp itself. The iron blade went between his ribs and angled toward his heart. The men attempted to cry out, but Abel's other hand sealed his mouth. They dragged him underwater, holding him as his struggling weakened, as the life drained from his body, until he was just another piece of the swamp. His expensive rifle sank into the mud, lost. "One," Abel whispered, feeling not triumph but grim satisfaction. This was justice. Crude and violent, but justice. They moved on carefully, tracking the edge of the swamp back toward the starting point. Gunshots echoed in the distance, then shouting that had an unfamiliar quality to it, the pitch of confusion rising into something closer to fear. The hunters had discovered something, likely one of the decoy trails the slaves had prepared. More disorientation, more disorder. Perfect. The second hunter they found was older and more cautious, moving with deliberate care. He carried a pistol in one hand and a lantern in the other, a tactical error that destroyed his night vision while advertising his position to anyone watching from the darkness. Abel let him pass, staying low in the water. Then Simon rose silently behind him and brought the heavy branch down across the back of his skull with devastating force. The men dropped without a sound. They took his pistol and his lantern. 2, Caleb counted. From different quarters of the swamp came the sounds of violence. A dog yelping, the sound ending abruptly. Men shouting in confusion, voices pitched higher than before. A gunshot, then another, then silence. The other groups were engaging. The plan was working. Abel's group reached the western edge and found Moses waiting with Thomas and Benjamin. Between them lay 3 dead hunters and 2 dead dogs, half submerged in dark water. Moses held a pistol he had taken from one of the bodies. "The horses?" Abel asked. "Scattered them as planned," Moses answered with quiet satisfaction. Cut through the tethers, fired a shot in the air. They bolted in every direction. Some of the white men went running after them on foot, away from the swamp. Pure chaos. This was better than Abel had allowed himself to hope. More disorder, more hunters isolated and vulnerable. "How many total?" Thomas asked. "At least 7. Maybe more, Moses said. But they're starting to understand something is wrong. I heard them trying to regroup near the center. Then we hit them while they're grouping, Abel decided. All of us together. One fast coordinated attack, then scatter before they can organize any real defense. They moved through the darkness toward the sound of men calling to each other, voices carrying a confusion that was curdling into fear. The hunters had indeed converged in a clearing, perhaps 15 of them, lanterns raised, weapons pointed at shadows. They were frightened now. The realization had taken hold that something had gone catastrophically wrong with their evening's entertainment. The predators had become prey and they understood it in their bones. Abel's group circled around them quietly, joined by Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah. Emerging from the north like figures stepped out of darkness itself. 13 slaves armed with stolen pistols, crude iron blades, clubs, and stones. 13 men who had nothing remaining to lose. They attacked from 4 directions simultaneously, a coordinated strike born of desperation, rage, and months of disciplined preparation. The gunfire was deafening, echoing across every surface of the swamp. Men screamed. Lanterns shattered, plunging sections of the clearing into sudden darkness. In the chaos, hunters fired at each other as readily as at the slaves. Abel saw Jonathan Reed, the slave trader from South Carolina, the man who had sold 15,000 human beings, fumbling to reload his rifle with hands that had begun to shake. Abel's blade opened his throat. 15,000 lives settled in one stroke. The fight lasted perhaps 4 minutes. When it was finished, 12 more hunters lay dead or dying. Those who remained fled into the darkness, their courage gone, running in blind panic like the prey they had come to hunt. Abel assessed quickly. Benjamin was dead, shot through the chest in the first exchange. David was gone, his skull crushed by a rifle butt. 11 men remained upright. Back to the plantation, Abel said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding through him. Before they can regroup. They moved swiftly through the swamp along familiar paths. Behind them came scattered gunfire, men shooting at shadows, fear consuming what remained of the hunting party. When they emerged from the swamp covered in mud and blood, the plantation was in complete disarray. Guests who hadn't entered the swamp were gathering their belongings in panic. Servants ran in every direction. Dogs barked without purpose. The horses that hadn't been scattered were being hastily saddled by trembling hands. The colonel stood on his platform, attempting to organize a defense, his face darkened with rage and alcohol and the first genuine terror he had likely ever experienced. "What are you doing?" he screamed at his guests, his voice cracking. "They're slaves. Just slaves. We have guns. We have numbers. We can." He never finished. Moses shot him from 30 feet away with a steady hand. The colonel fell backward off the platform and struck the dirt with the sound of something hollow, his blood spreading into the ground he had walked on like a king. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Swift and merciless. The enslaved people had surprise, desperation, intimate knowledge of every inch of the property, and the support of over 100 others who saw the moment and rose to meet it. The white men had panic, confusion, and the fatal arrogance of people who had never truly believed the enslaved could fight back. Ruth and the house slaves joined in using kitchen knives, heavy candlesticks, iron fire pokers, whatever was at hand. Samuel threw open the weapons cabinet in the colonel's study and distributed rifles to those who could shoot. The plantation slaves, previously outside the conspiracy, saw their chance and rose. 147 people turned on their oppressors with a fury that had been building across generations. By midnight it was over. 34 white men lay dead. The guests from Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, the colonel and his overseers, the handlers and supervisors, all of them finished. The main house was burning, flames climbing into the night sky like a signal visible for miles. The stables were burning. The cotton storehouse was burning. Smoke and fire transformed the darkness into a hellish kind of daylight. In the colonel's study, before the flames consumed it entirely, they found the leather bags containing $52,000. Abel stood looking at the money for a long moment, all that gold and paper representing wagers on human suffering. Then he picked up one bag and threw it into the fire. "We're not thieves," he said firmly. "We're not property anymore. We're free people. And free people don't take blood money." The others followed without hesitation. $52,000, the price of blood sport and human degradation, burning down to ash. As dawn approached and painted the sky in streaks of orange and pink, the survivors gathered in the yard. Of the original 13 selected for the race, 11 stood alive. Of the other plantation slaves, all but a handful had made it through. 143 people, no longer property, standing together as the sun rose on a new day. They took what supplies could be carried. Weapons, food, blankets and tools. They freed all the remaining animals except the horses, which they would ride in rotation. Then they departed in small groups moving in different directions initially to confuse any pursuit, all ultimately heading south toward Mexico and freedom. They left behind nothing but smoke and ruins and a story that spread across the south like fire through dry grass. The Blackwater race never took place again. The property was eventually seized by the state and auctioned off, but no buyers came forward. The legend of what had happened there, of slaves rising and slaughtering their masters, had made it cursed ground. Local people claimed to hear screaming drifting from the swamp on moonless nights. The buildings stood empty for years before finally collapsing from neglect. And in slave quarters across Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and beyond, people spoke in careful whispers about Abel and the night the hunters became the hunted. About the race that ended in fire and blood and freedom. The story expanded with each telling, becoming both symbol and inspiration. A reminder that oppression could be resisted. That the oppressed could strike back. That even the most powerful could fall. Abel and his companions reached Mexico 7 weeks later, after fighting through waves of bounty hunters and militia. Most survived to build new lives south of the border. Some returned years later after the Civil War to search for families shattered by slavery. Some vanished into history, their fates unknown, their names forgotten, but their actions remembered. The story lived on. And every plantation owner who heard it felt a tremor move through him, wondering whether his own slaves were planning something similar, wondering whether he too might one day face the accounting he had spent a lifetime earning. The Blackwater Massacre killed 34 white men and freed black souls. The financial losses, including property, crops, and human assets, exceeded $300,000. But the psychological impact was beyond calculation. A fracture in the foundation of slavery itself. Proof that the system could be broken by the very people it was designed to crush. And somewhere in Mexico, Abel built a quiet life. Never forgetting the night he was transformed from prey into predator. Never forgetting the men and women who stood beside him. Never forgetting that freedom is not granted. It is taken. Paid for in blood and fire and an absolute refusal to accept bondage as fate.